In the churchyards and cemeteries that surround Newark-on-Trent in Nottinghamshire and throughout the nearby villages of Lincolnshire, you will often find Ian Shipley habitually toiling away. He is the man that most of us would rather not see. He is the village gravedigger. In times past, most villages would have their own resident gravedigger. Many were retired miners or aging farm labourers who were not shy of a day's toil. Often the gravedigger would be referred to as the village sexton. His duties would include digging graves, bell ringing, and general care and upkeep of the church and churchyard. Many were respected pillars of their community. Very few of us give any real thought to how a grave is prepared. In fact, many people simply presume it is now all done by machine. Ian was taught how to hand-dig graves the old-fashioned way, learning his trade at Newark's London Road Cemetery, where he worked for over 20 years. Assisting a man named Edmund Scott, Ian dug his first grave at Newark on the 11th of May 1982. His induction, however, was far from easy. From day one, Ian's ability to complete such an arduous task was questioned by his colleagues, who judged that he would last no more than a few weeks, as they believed he'd find the work too physically demanding. That was 35 years ago.
You were barely out of your teens when you first became a gravedigger. Not the obvious choice of career for a young man, perhaps. Was it a conscious decision to follow that path, or how did you get started?
It certainly wasn't a conscious decision to become a gravedigger, do any cemetery work, churchyard work or anything like that, so no, it kind of happened. Like everybody else, when I left school I had no idea what I was going to do, and ended up in a garage spraying cars, which was awful. terrible man. But anyway, I got made redundant, and then I made a conscious decision that from then on I was going to work outside, no matter what. And the careers office sent me straight away for a job or an interview at Newark Cemetery, but it was like a non-existent post. It was nothing there, so I ended up having a terrible interview. After that I did Parks and Gardens and another related sort of course, and it was on the end of the second course that gravedigging was mentioned again by my supervisor, Mr. Jackson, who knew a gravedigger that lived in the next village, and he said if he could get some Saturday work, would I be interested? So of course I said yes, but unfortunately Mr. Jackson left to look after his ill wife, but he'd made notes in my file that I was interested in that sort of work, and so when the course came to an end I was encouraged to write letters to local authorities, undertakers, local places like that, and I got a letter back with an interview for cemetery gravedigger groundsman at Newark Cemetery, and it was like after the first time should I go back, but I did. I went back and I got the job.
In 2003, Ian left his full-time position at Newark Cemetery and set up his own grave-digging business. Across the county and occasionally beyond, Ian has completed work for 25 funeral directors, digging graves in 145 different locations. He has not looked back. Tolerating rain, wind and snow, excavating sand, clay and stone, removing tree roots, working next to plague pits, unearthing service cables and stable block floors, digging through sun-baked earth or pumping out contaminated water, dealing with troublesome unstable ground, and even carrying out stomach-churning exhumations. Despite all the trials and tribulations that a gravedigger can face, nothing has deterred Ian from achieving what has become his life's work. Now in his 35th year in the occupation, he endeavours to keep alive the age-old art of hand-digging a grave, though in his area of work he may well be the last. He had hoped to pass on his traditional skills, but unfortunately employees and random assistants have come and gone, and so for the foreseeable future Ian continues to toil alone. Next birthday, he will be 54 years old, and despite the aches and pains of older age, he is determined to continue, health permitting, for many years to come. His personal goal has always been to hand-dig 5,000 graves. Progressively, he is approaching that milestone.
You've dug over 4,000 graves since that first one back in 1982. At what point did you set yourself the goal of reaching a milestone of 5,000? And do you think you're going to get there?
Well, when I was self-employed, the amount 5,000 was achievable by the time I was 60, 62. I worked it out. And then the cemetery I had a contract for, they decided to bring it back in-house, which halved my work. So, although I've dug about 4,200 nearly now, yeah, another 800. Gonna take a few years. I think it'll take me longer than 62, but it's achievable, and I hope to do it. I'd like to do it. Round off 5,000 for 40 odd years' work. Yeah.
A good round number.
Good round number. Yeah, would like that. But whether I will or not, watch this space.
Ian lives with his wife Alison and their 2 dogs, Wag and Jocko, in Lincolnshire. For many years, he was actively involved in the underground punk scene. He produced a fanzine, managed his own record label, and was the vocalist for 2 local bands.
There's something in the darkness, there's someone watching me. There's zombies in the graveyard, I'm so scared. I think they've come to get me. There's no place left to hide. When darkness fades, the dead will come alive. Somebody screamed, this is Halloween. Tonight's the night the dead will walk the earth. Somebody screamed, this is Halloween. Tonight's the night the dead will walk the earth.
Although he retains his passion for music, he has since turned his hand to writing and is the author of 5 books. His most popular titles are Tales of a Gravedigger and A Gravedigger's Tales. Today, Ian is in a village cemetery in Nottinghamshire, where he's preparing to dig a new single-depth grave. This he'll excavate to a depth of 4'6". Traditionally, grave plots are spaced 4 feet between the centres of each headstone. Contrary to belief, however, not all headstones are fixed at the head end of the grave. Many are indeed footstones. So, how do you determine which way a grave faces? Ian was told one simple rule. All Christian burials face east-west, and as all churches are built on an east-west alignment, it was simple. Head spire, feet altar. Methodically, Ian begins to dig firstly by removing soil from the head end of the grave. Normally, most shoulder widths measure between 27 and 30 inches, while the foot end regularly tapers down to a mere 19 inches. This will allow sufficient clearance because at the end of the day, you do not want to get the coffin stuck.
Well, this coffin for this one is 6 foot long with 21 inches wide. So I'll dig it 6'7" by 28. I have a 19-inch head end and a 19-inch foot end. It's got fixed handles, so that should be adequate. Sometimes you can add 5 inches. I always add 7 because the time you bring it in with roots and that, it'll get smaller as you go down.
There's no right or wrong way to complete this kind of work. It's purely up to the individual, though it does help if you're ambidextrous, as you need to be able to throw out spoil both left and right. Digging freehand while keeping the proportions of both sides of the coffin-shaped grave flush and straight is not as easy as it looks. There is an art to it. From day one, Ian was told, they don't make coffins to fit your crooked-shaped grave, so keep your measurements true and the sides straight. This cemetery is one of Ian's preferred places to dig. Although tree roots can be a real problem, the sand and gravel mixture usually digs well, resulting in a respectable depth and a decent shape, which is something Ian makes every effort to achieve. This particular dig will take Ian between 3 and 4 hours to complete, but the job will not be entirely finished today. He will return on the day of the burial, when he will bottom out, straighten the sides, and check the overall measurements.
That one was a good one. Very good one. You don't get many like that. I could take them every day. Yeah. No, I like that one.
Show off.
On the day of the interment, the grave is dressed. Some refer to this as matting or greening up, a simple procedure whereby artificial green sheets are used to cover the spoil heap and surrounding area. Across the grave, 2 wooden put logs are placed. Put logs are the woods that the coffin will rest on prior to being lowered into the grave. The first put log is laid across the shoulders, and the other is placed halfway between the shoulder and the foot. Under these, a set of straps or webbings are positioned. These are folded neatly so that they don't get caught around the handles. Once the mourners have left, the green sheets and surrounding walkboards are removed and the grave is promptly backfilled. It's a basic procedure where the spoil is simply replaced. To some, it may look a bit undignified, but during the process Ian will tread down and compress the spoil. This is standard practice and will help to keep the grave level. Typically, he has about 2 hours to complete the work before the family returns to view the flowers. Any excess spoil is removed. The turf is reinstated and any adjoining headstones are wiped clean. Finally, the area is swept and made tidy. Floral tributes, starting with immediate family, are then placed down the centre of the grave, while all others are positioned along each side.
Now, most people probably don't give a lot of thought to the way graves are dug. If they do, they're more likely to think of it as a relatively straightforward task, but there is rather more to it than just digging a hole, whether by hand or otherwise. So what are some of the key things you need to pay attention to during the process?
Oh, I think you're right. I don't think many people do give any thought to the grave, especially on the day.
Of course.
You know, the minds are elsewhere, but as long as it's presented and dressed neatly, I'm happy. And the main thing, of course, is to make sure your measurements are right and that coffin goes in the old grave. I don't like calling it a hole, but we'll call it a grave. And that's the main thing. And I can sit in the van, and I always now still have when I see the coffin going over, you think, oh, it looks bigger than the size they've given me, or the handles will look different to what I've been told. But until the coffin's rested in the old grave, I never relax. But there is a lot more to it, keeping the shape. You know, I'm quite proud of digging it the old-fashioned way and keeping a shaped grave.
And have there been any particular problems that you've come across when you've been preparing for a burial?
Obviously, you've got to make sure the coffin fits the grave. That's the main worry you always have. And thankfully, I've never underdug a grave, but I've cleared it out and sorted it out for other people that have, which is quite embarrassing. The main one is collapse. You can never, it doesn't matter how sturdy the ground appears to be, it can collapse at any point or any time. And of course, rising water, which is always a problem, because you don't know how quick it's going to, how long people are going to be there, how quick it's going to. If the coffin's in the hole and the water's coming up, the coffin's coming up, and so that can be a problem. But they're the main 2 or 3.
The next stop for Ian is a Lincolnshire churchyard that is close to his heart. His mother's parents are buried here, but for Ian, there's a more emotional tie, because in 2015 it was here that he dug his own father's grave.
He died in the January, and in the December he asked me if I'd dig his grave. I just sort of laughed it off over Christmas, nearly Christmas dinner, you know, time. I just laughed it off, but I think he knew he was ill. And of course, I always said I would anyway, so, and we did. So, it's the last thing you can do for anybody, so.
Absolutely, but what an honour.
Yeah.
Not many people can say they've done that.
No, I don't think as many people would want to do it, to be honest.
No, but
You know. No. I'm glad I did it.
Thick, heavy clay and a high water table means a tough challenge awaits. But today he has an assistant, and he's accompanied by Wag, the family dog. Nowadays, Wag, who is in his 11th year, much prefers being at home with his mum to being out in all types of weather. However, on a warm summer's day, he likes nothing more than to bask in the sunshine. Wag has his very own snap bag. In it are his toiletries, water and bowl, and his favourite treats, gravy bones. If the mood takes him, he will carry Ian's gloves and coat, but he refuses point blank to lug around Ian's stinky boots. His principal job is to guard the tea and sandwiches, though like all staff, he likes to be rewarded for his help. A juicy bone, non-human of course, is his customary fee, and with that Wag is one happy chocolate Labrador. Ian is aware that the grave adjacent to where he's digging is the husband of the deceased. So, in order not to distress the immediate family, he ensures that the spoil heap is placed on the opposite side. In circumstances where there are numerous family graves, Ian will attempt to place the spoil at either the head or foot end of the dig. This is referred to as an end throw. This is something Ian will try to avoid doing, as it's never an easy task. If an end throw is not possible, then the entire spoil heap will be laboriously wheelbarrowed away. Fortunately, that is not the case today. The sticky grey clay may be slow to remove, but on the plus note, it's ideal for shaping. At this time of year, midsummer, the water table is relatively low. Nevertheless, the warning signs are there. With this in mind, Ian chooses to call it a day. The challenge is to know just when to stop. As this grave must stand 3 nights over a weekend, he decides to leave it just above the water level, and with a bit of luck, it won't seep in. On the day of the burial, it is unseasonably windy. Unfortunately, the weekend also saw heavy rain. Ian now knows that the grave will have water in it. The question is, how much? On removing the walkboards, he discovers that there's about 8 to 10 inches in the bottom. This is actually good news, because in the past, he has known it to fill the entire grave.
Well, the water's here because it's a high water table in this cemetery. I guess it comes from the Witham and it runs through the ground. In the summer it's not too bad, although as you can see, but in the winter it can be right to the top. It can be a couple of foot of water easy, but that's not too bad. I expected worse.
Many people do not realize that as the water steadily rises, it flows and passes through surrounding graves. As a result, it is often foul swelling and pretty unpleasant. The water is classed as contaminated, and so Ian will have to pump it out as far away from the area as possible. Up until the church service, he will keep a watchful eye on the grave, and when required he will continue to bail it out.
Yeah, I'm happy with that now. I can keep that under control, just bail it out when it needs it. Yeah, that's fine.
Before dressing the grave, 14 wheelbarrows of excess spoil are removed. But on a blustery day like this, it's not an easy task. As the procession prepares to go into church, Ian's final task is to mask the bottom of the grave with wood shavings. This will help hide the water from view. Backfilling is not easy here, as the chunks of clay do not compress down. Inevitably, this leaves air gaps, and only when it rains will the spoil break down sufficiently to restore it to its original level.
Yeah, it's awkward, it's sticky. The trouble is it doesn't break down when you tread on it and put it back in, it doesn't go back at all. So you could take 13 or 14 barrows away. Within a few weeks you're bringing 7 or 8 back. You just can't squash it back in. Not the same as it comes out, not this stuff.
It may look unsightly, but to allow for settlement, Ian will build the grave up quite high. For now, the turf is placed on top, but it's doubtful it will survive. It may look unacceptably high, but Ian knows that within a short time it will sink. On his next visit, he'll reinstate it to a higher degree.
Started the dig on Friday, as usual. Sticky, wet, horrible clay, water in the bottom. Well, what you'd expect for here, really. But I do like digging here because you can shape it well. If the clay comes out nicely, it makes it a good job. But it's all gone back well. Yeah, happy with that. Really happy with that one.
It's early morning. Ian is preparing a grave in a remote churchyard high on the Lincolnshire edge. The edge, or the Lincoln Cliff as it's also known, is a prominent prehistoric escarpment that rises 200 feet above the Trent Valley. Situated on this limestone plateau, en route between Lincoln and Grantham, are a number of villages. Digging in the churchyards along this route is demanding work. Unfortunately for Ian, the position of this grave could not have been in a worse spot. Two well-established yew trees stand at the head end of the dig, and although favourably they'll shade him from the blistering summer sun, the parched earth beneath them will be enough to test the skill and patience of any hand-digging gravedigger. Over the years, Ian has acquired a variety of tools that help him complete his work. However, despite the numerous different shaped shovels and spades he has, each designed for its own specific purpose, he will generally use the same digging fork he's had for over 20 years, a mattock, and a cheap spade that was an emergency buy from a DIY store. They are well worn and battle-scarred, and although they're now held together with strong duct tape, they continue to serve him well. Fork, mattock and shovel. For most digs, this is all Ian needs. But today, after contending with tree roots and stone, the going gets so tough that he has no choice but to bring out his jackhammer. The jackhammer is both noisy and heavy. At times it's awkward to use, but encouragingly it breaks through the earth, loosening and splitting the stone, thus making the job somewhat easier. Although the abundance of limestone slows the job down, it's the profusion of twitchy tree roots that repeatedly crisscross the dig that primarily impedes proceedings.
Glad when this one's done. Ooh.
After 5 hours of back-breaking toil, Ian's had enough. The job is not yet complete, but at least he's gotten the better of it. Ian will return a day later, spending a further 4 hours jackhammering in order to reach a satisfactory depth.
I come here this morning, I looked at it and thought, oh. Of all the places, under the tree, won't have had any rain on it for years. Dry as a bone, rooty, stony. But anyhow, we're getting there.
So, given the undeniably sombre nature of what you do, Just how do you manage to keep your sense of humour and a positive outlook on life?
Well, thankfully the job's never bothered me from day one. Finding bones in the churchyard, I've always found it more interesting and intriguing than anything else. And you know, even doing exhumations, shoveling out old coffins and bits and bobs, put into a new coffin to take away, it's never bothered me. You know, I've never lost sleepless nights over it. Every time I get sleepless nights, it's the amount of workload I've got, worried whether I can get it done and completed in time.
Over the years, you've been actively involved in the underground punk scene, you've managed your own record label, and you've been the vocalist for 2 local bands. More recently, you've published 5 books, 2 of them about your life and times as a gravedigger. So what prompted you to turn to writing?
I always said to the colleagues I work with at Newark that one day I'd write a book about, you know, gravedigging, the exploits and tales and stuff like that. And that was back in 1993, and the first book took 13 years before it was published. You know, the second one came out pretty quickly after that, and the other 3 I wrote after the band had finished, so I had more time, and that's the way I went. And I quite enjoyed doing it. So.
And at least one of them is dog related.
Yes.
It's
That's
about Wag.
Don't brag in front of Wag.
So, are there any other talents? We've talked about you've talked about singing. You've talked about writing, poetry, books. Are there any other talents or interests you'd still like to explore?
No, I think that's about it. I wouldn't say that's a talent anyway, but no, they're the things I like to do. But no, there's nothing left. But you never know what's around the next corner.
You most certainly don't.
Over the last few years, Ian has seen his workload plunge from 200 graves a year to about 90. Of these, only about 35 will be double-depth graves. A double is for 2 people, usually a man and wife. When conditions allow, a double will be dug to a minimum of 6 foot deep. Nowadays, this is deemed to be an acceptable depth, but in years past it was strictly 6 foot 6 inches. So, why 6 foot 6 inches? When cemeteries were introduced in the 1850s, the Victorians worked out that the approximate depth of a standard coffin was 18 inches, and so when buried in a 6 foot 6 inch deep grave, this left a depth of 5 feet for the second interment. On reopening the gravedigger would dig to 4 foot 6 inches, leaving 6 inches between the two. Again, allowing 18 inches for the coffin meant that from the lid of the second interment to the surface was 3 feet. This was seen as a suitable depth, as anything less could, in theory, attract the attention of certain animals such as dogs or foxes. Even burrowing animals like badgers and rabbits could, in theory, cause a problem. Although Ian digs the old-fashioned way, health and safety is paramount to his job, as he can't afford injury to himself or indeed the general public. When shoring or boarding out, Ian's preferred method is to use wooden planks, which are fastened at each end. They are fixed into the grave to prevent a collapse.
Health and safety has been in for quite a while. Well, there's not many places I go to I really need it, to be honest. Here you know you will, because it's sand. It's a bit of common sense, I think, really, more than anything. You know you're going to need it to put it in. Plus this is a graveside service tomorrow, so the last thing you want is more stood here and it's all to fall in.
As cemetery foreman, Ian completed his health and safety training while working at Newark Cemetery, where stringent rules and regulations meant that 90% of the graves he dug had to be shored. Each year, he completes a generic risk assessment, which is submitted to those parish councils that ask for it. Nevertheless, regardless of how detailed your assessment is, you can never be fully prepared for every eventuality. What Ian unsuspectingly unearthed in October 2011 very nearly cost him his life. While working in a Lincolnshire village, he unintentionally spliced through an electricity cable which was not documented on the churchyard plans. The cable was believed to have been laid in the 1930s and carried around 11,500 volts. The explosion not only knocked Ian off his feet, but blanked out half the parish. It also stopped the trains between Lincoln and Nottingham. The churchyard in question was renowned for having a high water table, but as luck would have it, the summer months had dried out the land. If, as usual, Ian had been knee-deep in water, then the outcome could have been very different. Strangely, this was the same churchyard where many years earlier another gravedigger had unearthed an unexploded bomb. In this Nottinghamshire churchyard, near to the River Trent, it's soft sand all the way. It is so light and fine that on a blustery day, when the land is dry, the spoil heap can literally be blown away. You can't get a much easier dig than this, but that often comes at a price. To avoid the grave having to be opened for any longer than needed, Ian has delayed starting it until the late afternoon. He must prepare a double-depth grave for the following morning. This afternoon's task is to simply kick off the dig and fix the shoring. Depending on how soft or unstable the land is, he will excavate it to approximately 30 to 34 inches before fixing 2 wooden planks, which will be supported at either end by butterfly jacks. This will adequately support the top, but in extreme cases he may add a 3rd or even a 4th set. Today, 2 sets are all that is needed. Once installed, Ian resumes the traditional shape before closing it down for the night.
Cool, tea time. On that end of the day.
This morning, Ian was on the road at 6 a.m. He has 2 burials in 2 different locations, as well as a double-depth grave to finish for tomorrow. He has already dressed and made ready a grave in a nearby village before hot-footing it to another cemetery, where he proceeds to complete the dig and dress it in readiness for his first burial. With the hour or so waiting times he has in between, Ian swiftly moves on and so continues digging the grave for tomorrow. The summer earth is dry and dusty, but a sturdy sand and gravel mixture makes for a relatively straightforward dig. With his trusty mattock, Ian soon makes light work of removing the remaining half of the grave. Time, however, quickly passes, and with the funeral now imminent, the dig is closed down and the area made safe. Once the mourners have left, the grave is promptly backfilled. There's little time to waste, as he needs to be elsewhere in readiness for his second burial of the day. Within an hour of the committal, the task is complete. The van is loaded, and with that he's off to his next job.
One down, two to go.
By the time he finishes and gets back home, Ian will have completed a tiring 12-hour day. And after a restful night's sleep, he'll do it all again tomorrow.
Next.
After 35 years, Ian still maintains his belief that a grave should be hand-dug, as it's more personal that way. He takes pride in his work, treating each job with absolute care and attention. The self-satisfaction and sense of achievement he feels after completing each job, no matter how awkward, makes it all worthwhile. Sadly, in Newark-on-Trent, Nottinghamshire, Ian Shipley will feasibly be the last traditional old-style hand-digging gravedigger. Unfortunately, this means that the art and knowledge may be lost forever. Tell me, Mr. Gravedigger, how long does it take to hand dig a 6-foot grave? And how do you get the sides so straight? You labour till you're weary with your trusty pick and shovel, outdoors in all weather, heaving out soil and other types of rubble. Tell me, Mr. Gravedigger, when you're cutting out the shape, how do you gauge the length and breadth? And have you ever made the mistake of digging it too small so that the coffin gets stuck? How embarrassing that would be for the mourners to see. How bad would that look? Tell me, Mr. Gravedigger, how many graves have you dug? Have you ever buried family or friends, or indeed anyone you've loved? From village to village, week after week, toiling from dawn to dusk. Kindly spare a thought for the gravedigger, for it's not often that anyone does. Tell me, Mr. Gravedigger, in God's acre grafting alone, as the sun sets and darkness descends, have you ever seen a ghost? Your work has been your vocation. For a lifetime you have slaved. But tell me, Mr. Gravedigger, when your time comes, who will dig your grave?